In 2017, Intel held over 90% of the desktop CPU market. By 2024, AMD had clawed back to nearly 50%. How did the silicon underdog flip the empire? The story starts in 1968, when Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore left Fairchild Semiconductor to found Intel in Santa Clara, California, betting everything on memory chips. 1 year later in 1969, Jerry Sanders led a team of 8 engineers out of Fairchild to launch Advanced Micro Devices just blocks away from Intel headquarters. Intel struck gold in 1971 with the 4004, the world's first commercial microprocessor, a tiny chip packing 2300 transistors onto silicon. AMD initially survived as a second-source manufacturer, legally licensed to clone Intel chips byte for byte, ensuring giants like IBM always had backup suppliers for critical orders. In 1981, IBM picked Intel's 8088 processor as the brain of its first personal computer, launching the x86 architecture that still dominates desktops everywhere today. IBM forced Intel to share the design with AMD. For years, both companies shipped nearly identical chips, with AMD usually undercutting Intel by significant margins. The peace shattered in 1986 when Intel refused to license its 386 chip to AMD. AMD sued, igniting a legal war lasting more than a decade. Through the 90s, Intel raced ahead with Pentium chips, while AMD scrambled to reverse engineer designs and undercut Intel on price, just barely staying financially alive. Then in 1999, AMD shocked the industry with the Athlon, the first consumer processor to break the 1 GHz barrier, beating Intel to the finish line by months. AMD followed with Opteron in 2003, introducing 64-bit computing to the x86 world while Intel was distracted chasing its doomed Itanium dream codenamed Merced. Microsoft adopted AMD 64 as the industry standard for 64-bit Windows. Intel was forced to copy it, branding the same instruction set EM64T. But Intel had a secret weapon: factories. Owning the most advanced fabs on the planet, Intel could iterate faster than any rival while controlling its entire supply chain. In 2006, Intel launched the Core architecture and recovered performance leadership with the Core 2 Duo, leaving AMD eating dust nearly overnight across desktop, laptop, and server lines. AMD doubled down on a risky bet, acquiring graphics maker ATI for $5.4 billion, hoping to merge CPU and GPU expertise into one. The ATI gamble nearly killed AMD. Debt ballooned, the Bulldozer architecture flopped at launch, and from 2011 onward AMD bled market share quarter after quarter. Intel's Sandy Bridge in 2011 was so far ahead, gamers and engineers stopped considering AMD entirely. Intel held over 80% of the consumer CPU market. Meanwhile, Intel got comfortable. Annual upgrades shrank to tiny single-digit performance gains. Critics nicknamed it the era of plus 1% improvements year over year. At AMD, a quiet revolution began. In 2014, electrical engineer Lisa Su took the CEO chair, inheriting a struggling company with a $2 stock and zero industry credibility. Su made one strategic bet: pour every available dollar into a brand new CPU architecture, codenamed Zen, designed completely from scratch to leapfrog Intel. Lead architect Jim Keller, returning to AMD after working on Apple A-series chips, joined a small team racing against the clock and the bank account. Intel meanwhile kept stumbling badly. Its 10-nanometer manufacturing process slipped year after year, stuck on 14-nanometer for an embarrassing 5+ generations of core chips. AMD outsourced manufacturing to TSMC in Taiwan, the world-leading foundry, and rode their 7-nanometer roller coaster straight past Intel's blocked process roadmap. In March 2017, AMD unveiled Ryzen. The first generation hit 8 cores at consumer prices, while Intel's mainstream chips topped out at just 4 cores. Reviewers were stunned. Performance per dollar doubled overnight, and PC builders flooded forums declaring AMD had returned from the dead with a vengeance nobody saw coming. Intel scrambled to respond, doubling core counts mid-cycle, slashing prices aggressively, and even renaming Skylake Silicon 4 separate times to look competitive on paper. Then AMD launched the Threadripper line, packing 32 cores into a workstation chip while Intel's flagship still struggled to match half that core count. The server market noticed. EPYC processors, AMD's data center variant, started winning massive contracts from Amazon, Google, and Microsoft cloud platforms one by one. Zen 2 arrived in 2019 on TSMC's 7nm node. AMD now had a clear process advantage that Intel simply could not buy or copy. Gaming benchmarks tipped. By 2020, Ryzen chips were outperforming Intel in many popular titles while consuming less power, costing less money, and running noticeably cooler. AMD's stock soared from $2 in 2015 to over $160 by late 2021, an extraordinary return that investors had never imagined possible. Inside Intel, panic set in. CEO Bob Swan was replaced by veteran engineer Pat Gelsinger, brought back to revive the company's lost manufacturing prowess. And then Zen 3 changed everything. AMD's Ryzen 5000 series swept every benchmark category, finally claiming the elusive gaming crown Intel had held for 15 straight years. Here's the moment it became real. In late 2020, AMD's market capitalization briefly crossed Intel's valuation for the very first time in chip industry history. Server market share surged. By 2023, AMD captured nearly 25% of the data center CPU market, up from less than 1% back in 2017. And then Apple delivered a second blow. Switching all Macs to in-house ARM silicon, abandoning Intel chips entirely, signaling the end of x86 dominance in laptops. Intel announced massive layoffs and $20 billion in new fab investments in Arizona and Ohio, betting the company on a manufacturing comeback by 2026. AMD passed Intel in total market value in 2022, becoming worth more than the company that defined personal computing for nearly half a century. Then came Ryzen 7000 on 5nm, then 9000 series, and AMD's 3D V-Cache turned gaming performance into a brutal one-sided fight. Intel's response, the 13th and 14th generation core chips, suffered widespread instability and degradation failures, prompting a recall scandal that further damaged the brand's reputation. By 2024, AMD held nearly half of the desktop CPU market on retail benchmarks worldwide. The underdog had finally become a true co-equal competitor again. So how did this happen? The answer comes down to three intersecting strategic choices that Lisa Su and her team made when company survival was uncertain. First, AMD bet everything on a totally new architecture rather than patching the failing Bulldozer line. Starting over was painful but unlocked years of headroom. Second, AMD partnered with TSMC instead of clinging to in-house manufacturing. Specialization beat vertical integration once chip nodes became too complex for any one firm. Third, AMD adopted a chiplet design strategy. Small dies stitched together yielded better, scaled cheaper, and let AMD outpace Intel's monolithic giants generation after generation. Intel's struggles came from the opposite direction. Decades of monopoly profits made the company slow to change, while its manufacturing complacency stretched the technology gap wider. The deeper lesson here is really about discipline. AMD survived a near-death decade because it kept reinvesting heavily in research even when shareholders begged for short-term cuts. It is also a lesson about people. One determined CEO with engineering credibility turned a 40-year corporate war into a textbook business turnaround story. The Intel versus AMD rivalry is far from over. Intel's 18A process, Gelsinger's fabs, and ARM's rise mean the next chapter could rewrite everything again. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe and tell us in the comments who you think wins next.